I think humans and buildings have always interacted, designing everything from how it's entered at the entry mat to the door handle to what the address placard, whatever it might be, all the way through how you're operating the kitchen sink or the window, and how it's opening and the blinds that are around it. I think design is how we connect. It's human nature to connect through buildings.
On this episode, I'm speaking with Nate Jenkins, principal at Oz Architecture in Denver, Colorado. Nate has over 25 years of experience and a distinguished portfolio of work spanning the globe. He's passionate about working with clients to develop projects with a high level of design while staying true to the environment and the communities within which their projects are sited. Nate has a deep passion for improving design through process, designing and developing projects that make a positive contribution, and is not afraid to push boundaries and make change happen. His experience includes millions of square feet of mixed use, commercial and retail, office, resorts and hospitality, K-12, higher ed, and multifamily projects. Without further ado, let's jump into this conversation with Nate. Okay, Nate, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today. It's great to see you again. We got a chance to connect this week, get a little lunch and catch up. So it's good to see you over virtual conversation as well.
It's great to be here, Chris. It's been many years in the making. Thank you.
It has been, yes. I was noodling with maybe wearing my Denver Nuggets hat for this interview, but I've been telling everybody I'm in mourning a little bit this week, so I'm just gonna leave it off to the side. I'll pick it back up maybe after the playoffs are over. But we'll wear our Denver pride in our stories and in our conversation today. So I want to jump in and really kick things off with you with a brief background of early years, because I love doing this. I'd love to know where you've come from, what you're all about. The history here is really cool. So why don't we start there? Just like Nate 0.0 in the early years.
Nate 0.0. Okay. Well, even when practiced, I'm unpracticed. I am often, as people who know me well will tell you, I'm very much an improvisationalist. So early years, was born in Walnut Creek, California. My father was a general contractor for Kiewit and officed out of downtown San Francisco for the years that I recall. Went to kindergarten out there in East Bay, California. But some of my earliest memories are of the city. I think it's Columbus Street that ties into Washington Square Park and is a direct line of sight of Transamerica Tower. And I have vivid memories of that, sitting on top of his shoulders in Little Italy. And I also have this very steep recollection of crossing the Bay Bridge and the cadence of the steel panels that would later fail in the 89 earthquake. But just seeing the skyline and going through Treasure Island and seeing the skyline of San Francisco was always something that I relished. And my parents had dear friends who lived in the city on Pine Street. And so I think that there was an incredible influence that early urban landscape played in me. And my parents were devout Catholics growing up. They became pretty staunch hippies in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, and did 3-year term in Ghana, Africa. And after that, I came about. The first few years in California were spent where we were, as I noted, and they decided to pick up and move to the countryside, which led us to somewhere between Montana, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. And the first place that my dad and my mom were able to find a good spot to call home was outside of Spokane, Washington, about 30 miles, in a small town called Chatteroy, which doesn't even really exist on the map unless you're really looking. And it's a town without a stoplight. So it was.
And that was a big transition, right? Like that was from city life as a kid to farm life as a kid, which I think starts to get at really where you're sort of, I don't know, sort of like we're ingrained with these very specific experiences early on on the farm.
For sure, Chris, and thanks. It was wild contrast, and one that I was certainly not comfortable with, admittedly, but it ingrained in me some incredible work ethic. When you're living off the land in many respects, and I don't want to exaggerate the condition, but there were weeks where we had no power. There was, we ate much of what we grew, and that's, I think there's more than 30 fruits and vegetables, and we, I helped raise probably to the tune of 200 plus sheep. We chopped, well, we didn't chop down the trees, but we would have big rounds, as they're called, large stumps that are cut in length that then we split, and mostly me split with, and then stacked to heat our home year round, or through the winter at the very least, I should say. And so just the cadence and the physicality of, slamming a maul, a 10 or 12 pound maul into the wood, you get into these visions or these zones where you're thinking, what about, whether it's the break point on the wood or more, at a 30,000 foot level, is this what I want to be doing with my life? And fundamentally, it felt incredibly contrarian in many respects. I was never fully comfortable with it, Chris. But in hindsight, what an amazing experience to have.
Yeah, yeah. And you told me recently that you're often thinking about those memories, good or bad, and sort of like you said, there's the compare and contrast there. That's not necessarily something that you loved doing as a youngster, but then at the same time you look back as an adult with raising your own family now, and kind of thinking, what lessons do I want to impart on my son moving forward? That's really pretty interesting. And I think from my understanding, you took those experiences and you said, you know what, let me get out of here. As soon as you could get out of here, you got out of there. And I didn't know this about your story, by the way, is that you ended up in the epicenter of an era that I wished so badly that I could be a part of. Once I knew of the era, because I came a little bit later, not too much later than you. You're not an old guy, and neither am I. But you ended up in Seattle in the midst of sort of this grunge art scene of the early to mid 90s. And by the way, I just recently rewatched one of my favorite movies of that era,
Singles. Baby. Singles. One of the best soundtracks ever.
Yes. And so I got to ask, what was it like then and there? Because you're one of the few people I know who was like then and there.
Oh my gosh, Chris. I vividly remember the day Kurt Cobain died. Let's just play that card. I was out on spring break of my junior year in high school and going to the West Side. We were East Siders. Many people call it EWA for a reason. And there's a very distinct demographic shift once you cross the Cascade Mountain Range. But for those of us who felt compelled to move to Seattle because it was cooler, hipper, denser, more culturally interesting and vibrant, what an incredible time to be there. You don't really realize it while you're in the midst of something like that. And I would almost parallel it to Denver in the late aughts, the early 2010, 11, 12, when Denver was super undervalued, but there were so many people moving here from the coast because of the lifestyle. Seattle had much of that. And it was before Microsoft had really blown up, and certainly before Amazon had. And so the impact of tech is real in Seattle, but it was not then. And, seeing Ben Gibbard playing in the back of a laundromat where PBRs were selling for $1, it was a cool lifestyle. And I think, as you and I talked, getting exposure to Alex Kaldenberg, the founder of Ace Hotel, who at that point was owned some bars and had a barbershop, and having this person who's transcended the hospitality space and has wildly affected co-working, or you could argue was one of the original co-working founders. And not only hospitality, of course, as I noted, but like multifamily has been in the amenity stack found in multifamily, in the spaces of this like co-working sort of lounge and all of these places where people mingle and co-inhabit are germane to what Alex was really playing off of. And that's the guy who used to, cut my hair. And so there was a lot of that innovation, unbelievable authenticity. Ballard was a place that was tangibly crafted by, Norwegian tradesmen, and that's certainly changed. But being exposed and going to the University of Washington in the mid 90s to some really fascinating professors who were there because they saw the craft and intellect in design and value that design had in that region, I didn't realize how valuable that exposure was.
Let's talk about that, because you did not know that you wanted to get into architecture
Mm-hmm.
when you landed at UW, and so I'm curious what that experience was like for you as call it a sort of bright-eyed young guy coming
Yeah.
from the farm life. Like, how did you weave your way into finding yourself in the
Yeah,
craft?
it's a really cool story in my mind, Chris. I was raised, and early on, even in the East Bay, I remember in kindergarten having the teachers say that I had skills as an artist and a creative, whether it was drawing book covers for myself and other classmates or poster contests. One of the things my parents did do was really sponsor and advocate for my artistic skills to flourish. And I was always in art school from age 4 or 5 through 18. And so it wasn't sports camps per se, because I was one of the younger guys in my class or people in my class. And I wasn't blessed with obvious athletic ability, but I did have obvious artistic ability. And so through all of those perspective classes and courses and high school art teaching, uh, I have some pretty cool art teachers that come to mind. You know, Mr. Gerald Riggs, rest in peace. But this man who just always gave me crap for some really, or had some off the wall ideas about how I was creating my art, and was very supportive. All this to say, when I'm at UW, taking all these pre-business classes and in the classroom with everybody from football players to fraternity boys or whatever it might be, I didn't feel like this was my destiny. And so I took, at that, freshman, sophomore year, you're still able to take some electives. And I took an appreciation of architecture course. And within a week, I knew exactly that this was what I wanted to do. It was pen in hand, walking around. I could draw these buildings these were just exercises as a part of homework, but I was finding myself captivated by the exercise. And so that paired with having an aunt, Diana Musman in this case, who's practicing architect in Portland and has been for many, many years, and seeing the impact. She's about 10 years my senior, 15 years my senior, 15, I think, or so. Seeing her go college crits at University of Oregon and seeing her practice certainly had an influence on me, in that I could see what this looked like down the road. And so it was from that point on, it's never been looking back. I've never looked back a single instance on, was this the right profession for me? And through now 25 years in the profession, graduating in 1998 and going to work 3 days after graduation, I feel like I hit the jackpot. Not many people get to say they're doing exactly what they think they're meant to be doing.
And you had a really inspiring design build program your senior year. You had this opportunity to travel to Mexico. I think you said it was 9 weeks or so. Mm-hmm. And from my understanding, that was like breaking bread, not only with locals, but like getting your hand in the literal dirt, building community. What was that? I mean, that seems like that was sort of a corner turn and almost like a cherry on top for this sort of like destiny finding you.
There's no doubt, Chris. In fact, I get goosebumps fairly easily through a lot of different interactions in the day. Mexico design build, Steve Bedaines and Sergio Palaroni. University of Washington was one of the first design build programs in the country. We at the time, going international was totally off of my radar. I had a very small-minded upbringing, in the sense that even though my parents had spent 3 years in Africa, and I got to see the textiles and some of the art and the masks that were born upon the walls of our home, it wasn't a real reality for me. And then this opportunity came up to do this program, and got accepted into it, and live in the city of Cuernavaca, which is about an hour south and west of Mexico City, which at the time was the largest and most dangerous city in the world, statistically. This is January of '98. Cuernavaca is, I believe, the city of roses. We designed and built a women's and children's health clinic with our hands, and with the community members. We spent a week designing it and about 8 or 9 weeks building it, and mixing barrels of cement with barrels of water or buckets, and crushed granite that we were crushing with our hands, that were broken through tire axles that had been modified into chisels, and just breaking these stones. I found myself right back into the place where I was chopping wood and breaking these stones and building foundation walls and pouring concrete to build the foundations upon which these masonry buildings were being erected, and working and engaging with the community in a way that was so intensely deep. These people lived in a squatter settlement called Tejalpa, and they were eating the chickens, and the chickens were drinking from the creek that was downstream from the pharmaceutical plant. And none of the women were able to get pregnant, because it turns out the pharmaceutical that was being manufactured upstream was birth control. And so that is the kind of settlement that we were in. And yet these people were so fabulously happy and endearing. And they were sweeping their dirt floors thinking that these were white oak, white plank floors that are in yours and my houses. And there was such an appreciation for culture and for what the third world views as beautiful, that it really, and then being able to build your own design, there's something in that was just so authentic and memorable. It had a significant influence on me, and every move that you make should have a purpose. Every move that you make should be in response to the human condition. And because there's nothing excessive in those environments, there's very little waste. Everything is used or reused. And so I think it set me on this course for being smart about every design move that I make. So yeah, it's cool.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Transforming Cities, brought to you by Authentic, delivering premier multifamily brand experiences in smart digital marketing. Authentic's proven approach accelerates leasing velocity, boosts rental rates, and increases long-term value. You can find out more at AuthenticFF.com. And by Charles Gate, the multifamily investor's secret weapon to help underwrite, go to market, and operate projects that generate market-beating returns. With an adaptive staffing model and on-demand leasing teams, Charles Gate empowers a better resident experience at an efficient cost structure for today's owners. Visit charlesgate.com for more. Well, let's talk about that bridge from that experience to your professional life in this journey to the real world, so to speak, as an architect. We've talked about how, because I experienced this same thing, where schooling can be very theoretical. I went to design school. I was trained to be a 3D animator, and there was a lot of theory there rather than practical application. What did you feel like you experienced coming out of school and really hitting the real world for the first time?
Chris, there's no doubt in my mind. I had a very strong theoretical based schooling, and I had no understanding of how to put a construction document set together. I had very limited understanding of means and methods in terms of how to put things together physically. Great at coming up with ideas and theories on how a story might be told, but having an intentionality behind how it's actually built was certainly lacking. And so it was my mission to learn that quickly and go to immediately out of school, went to a very small firm that put me into my very first drawing as an architect was a ship's ladder detail, which is it's a ladder that takes you to the top of an elevator penthouse. First of all, I'd never heard of a ship's ladder, and I would have never had an understanding of why a ship's ladder is necessary, but it basically takes you to the top of the penthouse to allow access to service the elevator. But what an incredible contrast from designing cool, aspirational women's and children's clinics or museums in Seattle to a ship's ladder detail on a flagged hotel, Courtyard by Marriott in this case, in Federal Way, Washington. So at the same time, and then that progressed into tile detailing and reflected ceiling plans for Nordstrom stores. And so in that very high degree of granularity, I'm thinking, well, what is this? How is this relevant to me in my future practice? Because everything's a step. And I think, well, at least it should be. And it was, everything's done in phases or chapters of a book. And as I like to describe it, And that chapter was intensely focused on just being the best tile detailer or reflected ceiling plan drafter I could be, knowing all the well this wouldn't be for me in the long term, but knowing at that time that I needed that intensely, almost surgical accuracy in my theory, and so theory is only so good when you can't apply it. And so having the ability to apply the most simple things and be really good about that, I do believe really enhanced my practice years later.
You told me about this first year where you had this agreement with Kurt
Yeah.
Jensen in that you would quit after 1 year and then move on from there. And you actually, the path forward was you stuck to that, and you joined you called it a prolific international team. I think this is really a cool story from earlier in your career. Can you
Sure.
hit some of the highlights of this? Because I think it touches on this idea of where kind of theory meets practicality and some of the projects you were able to touch at that point.
Absolutely. Yeah. Kurt was a great role model in my career, in my trajectory. We made an agreement that there wasn't the firm for me long term early on. And I found myself a year in, he tapped me on the shoulder. He said, "Hey, it's time for you. Your ship has sailed." And he knew, and I knew that I'd have a place to land fairly quickly. I interviewed at a number of the large firms in Seattle, and there's some great ones there, the likes of which are, MBBJ or Methuen. And I'd actually taken a job with Methuen, was on my way to the office, and Callison called with an offer that I couldn't refuse, and turned back around I got off on the next bus stop and took the bus back, because at the time driving into downtown was not an option. But long and short, I ended up at this firm called Callison. Callison at that time was around 250 people. And by the time I left there 8 years later, it had grown to 750, one single office, 5 floors in an office building that they had designed before my time. But I had no idea the talent level that was present. Every corner of that building was filled with captivating stories and backgrounds and people who aspired to do great things on a domestic and international level. I worked in every continent other than Antarctica to some degree, from Tokyo to Warsaw, largely doing mixed use shopping centers. Shopping centers is the base, and then hospitality, residential, office buildings were always grown from out of that basis. But I'll tell you, there were people who were traveling 250,000 miles a year and coming back refreshed and vital, and coming back with napkin sketches of the world islands in one case, where I was the first person to effectively CADify, for lack of a better term, put into AutoCAD, in that case, MicroStation, the world islands, which are now built. And it seemed at that time somewhat absurd. It still seems, frankly, a little absurd to me, Chris. But just being around such creative and aspirational talent was unbelievable. And there was not any tangible evidence of ego. There was high degrees of collaboration. Every corner of the office literally had a collaborative space that you'd see constantly active. And, just recently, earlier this late winter, was in Portland for a conference and got to run into a series of colleagues. And we were all peers and partners, trying up and comers at that firm. And we're all in different places now, but it was so fabulous to just reminisce with these people how much talent we were around, and what a great place to work that was. So
you said that you were during your last year, I think it was, you won a fellowship. I think it was a $10,000 grant at the time that was meant to sort of like benefit you and the firm. And you were doing what I'm doing now, essentially in a maybe a shorter time domain. But you said that you leveraged that money. You traveled to a variety of architectural figureheads around the world. And you were able to meet with them in person and sort of pull as much knowledge out of them as possible, and then present it back to the firm. I don't want to jump too far ahead here too quickly. So before we move forward, tell us about that experience. Cause I mean, you dropped some pretty big names. It's a pretty cool experience.
It was without question a threshold moment for me. I struggled with a lot of sort of small town mindedness. but was around some pretty prolific talent at Callison and many, Harvard Graduate School of Design or GSD uh, alumni, if you will, unbelievably connected professionals. I had the luxury of meeting with Bill Valentine for 2 days, the president of HOK at that time, and a gentleman, his partner, Ali Mugadasi, who was the chief division of, I think, the aeronautical division of HOK, and just pick their brain for how they approached their practice. Calman McKinnell and Wood, who was AIA Firm of the Year in 1980, watching Gerhard Kalman, who was 80 something at that time, walk into work every day and meet with Michael McKinnell, and see how Boston City Hall came to life, and see some of the pragmatism that the GSD alumni certainly apply in their process in Boston. And then, not last but not least, but certainly probably the most memorable time was or interview was with George Miller and his team at Paycobb Freed and Partners, and getting to meet IM Pei and see the model shop and be in the heart of my financial district in New York City was, for a kid from Chattaroy, just out of this world. And truthfully, knowing and seeing my, this was an idea that very few people supported or thought that I'd be successful in doing, and that is talking to the world's top architects. Spending 3 days with Glenn Murcutt, who was, he's a Pritzker Prize winning architect out of Australia, who at that time had no email, but only a fax number and a telephone, a hard line that his wife would answer to relay onto him how we would be connecting. And he was an adjunct professor at University of Washington, which is how I got time with him. But getting unbelievably diverse in terms of project type to persona and personality type, getting to experience how they process, storytell, the virtues and values that they believe architecture should have and that architects should practice was unbelievably insightful. To this day, I will never forget those moments. This is not even, forget the fact that I talked to Antoine Predock on the phone, rest in peace. And sadly, some of these names are no longer with us, but true icons. Joshua Ramos on the phone, you name it. I was getting Richard Meyer, I was able to talk to on the phone, and just ask these questions. How do you practice your design? And the fact that they gave me time, and whether it was 15 minutes to half an hour, and that I was able to distill that information and translate and sort of develop my own thesis on what process should look like. Obviously, that exposure is second to none, and that $10,000 was priceless for me. And then at the end of all of that, have to present that in front of a peer group. And I don't know about anybody who's listening. I'm less nervous now being one-on-one with Chris, but I get more nervous when I think about the audience. And so in the case of this presentation, presenting to up to, probably 300 or 400 people in the end, because not everybody shows up from the firm. But I had an out-of-body experience. I truly wish I had it on video, because I blacked out. I don't remember anything that was said. I do remember that there was an applause at the end, and it was a meaningful and memorable presentation that I sadly won't remember, but I will remember everything that got me to it. And then from that point on, I will tell you, it extracted a lot of the fears and hesitations I had about speaking publicly. So what an incredible exercise that was.
Well,
yeah.
Let's talk about those stepping stones from Callison, because a lot has happened, because I want to get to really where you are today, kind of like the story that you've built in Denver so far, because you've used the word prolific a few times now. And I think you're getting to the point where you're a prolific figure in the Denver architecture scene, if you haven't already been there for a few years. So you spent that time at Callison, which was obviously an incredible experience. Then you became the director of design, I believe, at Alberta Development Partners. And then you kind of came back into your first role. You were in Denver again. But at that time, let's say this is 2008-ish, there's the great financial crisis. You went through a bunch of interviews, and then you eventually made a move back home. And so we're doing a big circle here. That period sounded really tumultuous, but also on a sort of meaningful level, an important time for you to kind of to go full circle at that time.
Yeah, it was a full circle and a humbling one, where I was literally and figuratively um, kicked from the penthouse to the basement. Had to short sell a condo in Seattle. I came to Denver with a significant ego. Was definitely out skiing my tips, and financially, and really I needed to be humbled. And the universe tends to do that to you when you're ready, whether you're ready for it or not. And yet, at the same time, those 3 years where I was really out on my own, trying to practice architecture to the highest degree somebody without a license could at that time, under the entity Nathan Jenkins Studio, and leveraging a hobby to become a professional photographer, which was hugely instrumental in my practice over as time would go on, frankly. But taking pictures for other architects of their buildings, which at that time there was no Instagram. There certainly wasn't an Instagram that is today. And I had talents as a photographer, and being able to leverage those to get small bite-sized projects from other architects just by photographing their work, or just through word of mouth, brought me a lot of odds and end jobs that made me a little bit more savvy, both financially, but also helped me create a business development bone in my body that I may have naturally had, but definitely had not needed to practice. And so between that and the professional management side of things, and having, I had up to 5 employees, and we would office out of local cafes, and I'd buy them coffee or breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner. And we were co-working before WeWork existed, and before the likes of Galvanize existed, even here in Denver locally. And so we were on that leading edge of co-working and collaborating in an open cafe space, which of course is what Alex did, and his vision for the Ace Hotel was doing in Soho. And so I had no idea that I was really sort of living what many of my other mentors and peers had been doing, somewhat surreptitiously. And so that was really neat. But after 16 cities, interviewing in 16 cities, the first call I get is a 3-month contract for a firm in Spokane, ALSC Architects, an incredible powerhouse for a firm of its size. They do great work in the region. I was able to go back home willfully, not out of desperation, but willfully move back to my
not unwillfully.
Yeah, well, at some point the universe might send you home because that's the last option. In this case, who knew that I'd find a job as an architect to help maybe change the course of how they practice. They saw value in what I was bringing to the table in terms of my exposures and the way I was practicing. And I got to live with my folks for a couple months. Of course, once 3 months became a year, I found myself moving into downtown Spokane, which in a loft that would later be in a Macklemore video, ironically. Sidebar, but anecdotal, anecdotally cool. If Macklemore thinks Spokane's cool, I can too, right? So we're in Spokane practicing some incredible things. I'd never done K through 12 or much higher ed stuff, or projects, I should say. And it was so enlightening. It was so incredible how talented this firm was. And when I'd come from such a talented firm in Seattle, thinking that Spokane was sort of a wasteland, and no, there's authentic curators of the profession of architecture in Spokane, and I'm forever grateful for that 1 year and 4-day exposure. I need to tell you that I have that number in my head because I never actually wanted to leave Denver. I knew Denver was about to blow up, but why not give the shot to Spokane when I had a place to stay and plenty of friends and family to hang out with, and then forget all the new friends and family I was able to make in that year time, including, of course, as you know, but the audience doesn't, meeting my wife the month before I moved back to Denver. So pretty dang cool.
Pretty dang cool. And you had a pretty dang cool story when you get back to Denver. I called it the drive-by decision, which is pretty cool. For the listeners that don't know you have an endless Rolodex of vocabulary for one, but you have a ton of stories in your back pocket, and it makes for a really interesting conversation. And this was one where I took from some of our earlier prep conversations around getting back to Denver and settling in. And there was this decision that you had to make, and I can't remember who it was. I think it was a mentor that
Yeah.
told you you had these opportunities with two different firms, and you can sort of fill in the blanks here. But then you had to drive by to see kind of what was going on at a certain
Yeah.
time of the evening.
Yeah. No. So I came back to work for a great firm here in Denver. In the Beck Group. And the Beck Group was an incredible exposure, but it wasn't there wasn't the right fit for what I was hoping to practice. And right or wrong, we had a mutual departure, and in about 3 or 4 days, I was down. I had gotten offers from Davis Partnership, who's a prolific and wonderful design firm here, and Oz, and just this idea of live work life balance at the time is sort of a catchphrase that started about that period of time, 2011, 12 or so. And I was with Paul Mack, who was a tremendous architect and artist, who's now more of a DJ in Crested Butte than he is, I think, an architect. But he and I were at a St. Louis Cardinals game at Coors Field, and I say that with intention because Coors Field, there's often more fans from the opposing team than there are Rockies fans. But we're sitting there in the sea of red, and he just said, "Listen, why don't you drive by both of the offices? It's about 9:30 on your way home, and just see, which parking lots got more cars in it, and which lights are on, and are they authentically doing the live work life balance that they have projected?" And let's just say, right or wrong, the decision was so narrow that was the sort of the straw that drew me to Oz. And 10 and a half years later, I'm here and a principal here, filled with gratitude for both that moment, but obviously the future that decision would have. So,
and really, I would venture to say that one of the biggest areas that we've connected with over the years and come back to consistently is this idea that design matters, form matters, finishes matter, brand matters, the experience in a building matters. And from some of your early memories about Oz and getting connected with them and comfortable with your early roles at Oz, you always spoke really highly about, how process isn't just an idea. There's this intentionality behind the work that they do. And from the earliest days of Oz, it sounds like that theme was very strong with that group. Obviously, you've been there for quite a few years now. What were the early weeks and months like joining the team there?
I was sort of hired not because they had a place for me or a specific position or project for me to go upon, but I think that there was a natural chemistry that was here, Chris, and so they brought me in. And I think initially I was placed onto what at the time was called the senior living team. I think it's moved on to active adult or older age adult care. And so it sort of grew from that to around the office, starting to permeate into a number of different practice areas, and working with a series of different principles, but sort of landing upon one fairly quickly in Kelly Davis, who's been instrumental in the growth of my career, the trajectory of my career. But we were able to start. He was really focusing on mixed use, whether it was in Boulder or Indianapolis, in the case of the project that I was really introduced to him on. But I will say, one of the beauties and the virtues of Oz that drew me was that I had an authentic insight, confidence, I should say, that I was going to be able to have a role to play and changing how we do practice. And over time, I had to certainly be patient and work on myself and my delivery, and still working on that every day, Chris. But one of the things Oz did nurture in me very early on was that they felt that I came with some expertise that wasn't here. And so it was pretty early that I was given unbelievable liberty to do diagrams. I guess there's a few behind me. Diagram, story tell, visualize, unique and different to how they had been practicing. And it was just their being open to bringing somebody new in and allowing them to grow and show, and how that could be done. And really, I believe I've had a role to play in how our firm is doing these things today. in a greater way than I had ever envisioned. It's been a really incredible thing to witness. And I hope it doesn't come across as if I'm taking exclusive credit here, but one of the key points in my coming to Oz is I just sensed that it's very entrepreneurial. It has proven to be that, almost immediately was proving to be that, as you asked the question, in those early days here, it was evident that I was going to be able to do to some degree, what I wanted to do and how I envisioned this practice being, and imparting some of that on a daily basis, and through my actions being effectively leading by example, and to be able to see that the outcome of that has been so incredibly valuable and wonderful to see.
Another area of your professional development that we've talked about recently is this really cool, and you said you've probably always had it within this sort of connector sense, and this like business development, relationship focus, as I think been intrinsically ingrained in who you are for a long time. But I think Oz served as another stepping stone for you to travel to new cities, grow in relationship with clients and friends. And one of the things that you told me about relationship is that you try to be in relationship with these people, both inside and outside of the office,
Yeah.
right? Going back to my previous sort of thought and prompt with regards to design mattering and form mattering and finish mattering, I know that you care so much about that. Why do you feel like all of those things tie together and are so meaningful in the work that you're doing? And how does that relate to these relationships that you've amassed over the years?
That's a deep one, my friend. Listen, I think design matters. I believe more and more as the buildings that surround us maybe are of less design value than maybe we would think they should be. Whether you're an architecturally trained person or you're not. In the case of my wife, who's noted many times that's just not, that building doesn't meet standard. It's just visually not impressive or aesthetically pleasing, whatever it might be. I think humans and buildings have always interacted. And so designing everything from how it's entered at the entry mat to the door handle to what the address placard, whatever it might be, all the way through how you're operating the kitchen sink or the window, and how it's opening and the blinds that are around it. I think design is how we connect. It's human nature to connect through buildings. And I think as you and I have connected personally, but I think we always have the built environment to sort of leverage as a commonality. And I think everybody can react to the built environment that they're in. We are always interacting with it. And so whether you're architecturally trained or not, I think one of the things I try to do is get into the mind of whether it's client X, Y, or Z or consultant A, B, or C, find out where their aesthetic preferences might be, and dive into the hows and whys of what they're seeing. One of the coolest things, and we haven't talked about this, but one of the coolest things I have imparted in my practice, and I learned this really early on at Callison, was taking tours of cities with your peers and partners, taking clients to Portland, whether they're 60 or 70, and having them stay at the Ace Hotel in downtown Portland, and showing them how micro housing looks and feels, or can look and feel, because I feel like Portland exceeded the mark aesthetically on some of the cheapest forms of housing types. Or taking clients from Denver to New York City and whirlwind touring 30 something buildings and showing them what's important about how the diagram's been applied, or how the fenestration's been applied, or what the spatial sequence is from a lobby entry to the amenity space at the rooftop, and talking about this and marinating in design with my peers, counterparts, and owners. This is where my greatest successes have come, is when you are able to really break bread with people, talk about design, talk about their families, and then ultimately at the outcome of this, you're so much more aligned that you're then able to more concisely, maybe less iteration, I would hope, but certainly with a common interest that's molded based on that experience, the pre-existing experiences, have a better target in mind for what the building wants to be. That is, I think, one of the greatest design exercises that I have, and I think it's personal, and it's not something you can do over a Zoom call. And I think COVID was definitely not great for practicing high design. But even when you're person to person in a conference room, there's only so much time you get together. So when you're able to wake up with somebody and spend the entire day with them and talk about design and find out what's important to them and how they experience buildings or what they see in the buildings around them, I think that's a huge driver in what gets me jazzed in this profession.
I would love your thoughts on this in this disconnect that we see between architectural design and the work in the world that you live in and brand and the on-site experience. It's something that
Yeah.
we definitely have talked about over the years, right? So, we've lamented over this idea of a really beautiful building, and then, the brand and the on-site experience is just sort of an afterthought and slapped onto your beautiful building, or the inverse, right? Where there's a Kleenex box of a building and there's a beautiful brand for whatever reason that's associated with it. These two are clearly complementary components of the same story, and they need to work together. What is it about that dance that you find that you're sort of two-stepping with in your work, week in and week out?
Yeah. Well, the two step is often a derivative of the structure of the opportunity. Depending on the client, they may or may not agree with the importance of that brand continuity or the interior finishes needing to the undergarments needing to match the blouse or the dress or the shirt and pants, and so some of this is self-selecting. I think in my idealized world, and I think by and large the people that I surround myself with, even clients, there's an authentic understanding that the most successful buildings are ones that are legible. The building story is legible from the 30,000 foot level, but all the way through the entries, through the doormat, as I noted it prior, but all the way to the point, all of the touch points of the building, and whatever its name should have some, whether it's a physical address, which is the literal case in point, or a name that's related to the design and its story. That continuity is, whether it's certainly conscious from the design team's perspective, but I do authentically believe that the casual visitor of the building may not consciously know what they're experiencing, but when there is such a stream of consciousness, for lack of a better term, or an execution of a concept and through the building, I think that there's a natural liking of that building that is not like a building that doesn't have that continuity. And it's I think there's a pretty one-to-one correlation there. I don't have the statistics to prove it, but I also would tell you that as designers and the consultants that are working on any one of these projects, the countless projects that you and I have touched over the last couple of decades, I think it's more fun when the whole team is on board early on, and we're able to sort of bounce ideas off of each other. And listen, you may be a brand and identity expert, and I am not that, but I have a huge desire and have designed many logos in my lifetime. And you have a huge desire to impart yourself on architecture. And so that collaborative spirit has to happen early, or that engagement has to happen early for ultimate success. And so I am grateful that there's more opportunities of that nature. More and more, I feel like that's become important, because it's clearly a distinguished item, or it's an element or factor that differentiates one building from the many. Certainly in the Denver marketplace, certainly in Salt Lake City, certainly in Phoenix, certainly in Columbus, Ohio, or Fort Worth, where we're doing work, actively doing projects today. I think having that brand continuity and architectural continuity with the brand in alignment has proven to be a huge asset to any project that has that.
Well, as we begin to wrap up here, I would love to ask, because I know that we have listeners that are at a different place in their career right now, given your journey, and especially with your experiences early on in your career, today there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the real estate world, the markets, the capital markets, certainly, and sort of what is being built versus what is not being built. What advice would you give to the next generation, so to speak, of, call it, architects, designers and marketers in and around the real estate space? Big
It
question.
is.
I know that you're going to give me a great answer though.
Gosh, I'm doing my best. I will tell you. Listen, I think one of the reasons I came to Denver was to learn how to be a developer, and I think always asking questions, always remaining curious. I know it sounds cliche, but understanding what capital markets are, understanding why rates going up and down make a difference on our business, our ability to execute our work, having that insight, and having a rental house and understanding what being a landlord is, or having an authentic, or associate yourself with somebody who does have those things and really get to know the nuts and bolts of what the economic drivers are for what makes our projects happen is is a huge attribute in a conference room when a client is saying what's difficult or challenging about what we're doing and how we have to get the dollars down, and why, having a keen awareness of why that's important. But then what's most important, of course, is not having that awareness, but having an understanding of how to pull value engineer. And that's a constant in every project. It doesn't matter if it's public work or in public sector work or private development driven. Right now, value engineering is on every project that Oz has, maybe with 3% being an exception. But having a keen awareness and curiosity about the toggles that developers have, that we can help inform inform the prioritization of those, so that the project can happen in a way that maybe is more receptive to a positive design outcome, as opposed to just trimming off whole facades of quality materials for the sake of saving money. There are other ways to do it, and I think one of the things that I have tried to thrive in this profession doing is being unique in the deployment or application of cost-saving measures. And some of that is natural instinct, but more importantly, it is informed by personal experience and a curiosity about and extensive conversations with developers about what's important to them. So and I would say half the cases of my project work, design was not the chief driver in what got this project built, and yet informing them about why design is important, whether it's psychological or physical, aesthetic or spiritual. There's so many different values that I think design has, but it's on us as architects to really instruct and inform our clients as to what's important about it and why it's important. And it will help ultimately through being principally balanced and focused. It will, there's room for design to persevere, let's just say. And so I think having optimism about that is important. It's hard to keep it, but always saying, to yourself that, design does matter. And as long as you are educated in the why and how of that, and always looking beyond the US for examples, how Europe's doing it, how Asia's doing it. I think always leveraging the exposures that we now have on social media, whether it's Instagram or other, Arc Daily or other. Dwell is a great one to see how people live at a very small scale, but being able to apply some of the stories and anecdotal pieces and parts that are in those houses to multifamily for me has been a huge thing. So I don't know if I've answered your question directly, but I've tried to answer your question.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. I think that's really great practical advice for anyone in the midst of a early career or starting a career in the space. I think those are really important takeaways. Well, one of the things I really love to do is this little rapid fire section before we wrap up. I'm going to ask you two questions. I've been giving you a little bit of a head start here because I know you have good answers. But first, knowing your history and involvement in the real estate world, tell me about the most exciting development project you've seen in the last year or so.
Yeah. My wife and I got to take a trip late September, October of this last fall to Copenhagen, which has been, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site for a reason. And 2,200 photographs over 7 days would prove that I was captivated by this place. And there's a project there called Paper Island, which has largely been planned and designed by Kobe. It's an incredible firm from the Netherlands, and it's an incredible place. It's a it's authentic in form and materiality, and yet it's very unique and vibrant in its own way. It's creatively applied some of the historical gestures of that city and the landscape of that city, and reinterpreted in a way that I will never forget. It's just all I can say is that you have to go, and every architect that I talk to knows. Most of them know that they should be going. I'm just saying, put it at the top of your list because it is just a marvelous place. It sits on the water, but there's an incredible there's an incredible series of vital uses there that are all. It's bike forward and friendly, of course, as the entire city of Copenhagen is. But I found the architecture and just the usage of materials to be exquisite and extraordinary. So, yeah, that's my number one right now. Paper Island.
Okay, that's a great one.
All
That's a
right.
great one. Tell me about your number one book. Sometimes a gimme, sometimes a difficult
Man.
one for guests to answer and just give one.
I know my wife's going to listen to this at some point, so she'll attest. I'm not a prolific reader, but the book that I have gone back to most recently is From Good to Great. It's a book by Jim Collins that I read right when it came out. And he, in fact, spoke to our leadership group when I was at Callison when he recently finished it. Listen, it just talks to how the best of the best practice management styles, enable their employees, guide their employees. And listen, I'm not inherently blessed with skills in that capacity. So for me, it's been a good refresh. But ultimately, it speaks to the human condition, and some of the best corporations still focus on the people that work for them. And I think Oz does a really good job of that. I think for us, rereading books is an interesting thing, Chris. I don't know, I'm sure you do it. And I think you actually mentioned this the other day. But for me, that's the best book I've had from a professional perspective in my quiver.
I love it. These are great recommendations. And for the listeners and viewers, we're going to be adding these into the show notes below. So feel free to grab a copy and definitely check out Paper Island as well. Well, Nate, there's only one more thing to do here, and that is to roll out the digital red carpet for you. Tell the listeners what you're up to
Sure.
and where they can find you online.
Gosh, what am I up to? You can find me online. I'm Nate J. Jenkins on Instagram. I would love to hear from you. I'm on LinkedIn as well. You'll find me as I think it is Nate Jenkins on LinkedIn as well. But I think the links are going to be provided. But listen, we've got a 4.5-year-old. He has been the brightest light in our lives. You'll find me. Our world has gotten smaller with him, but we're still going to try and do an international trip every year. And listen, just getting out of the city has been, it's always captivating for him, and seeing his captivation for us is incredibly fulfilling. Every day I come home, we go for a walk, and we've recently acquired trash picker uppers. I think they're like $20 on Amazon. I can't tell you, they're almost priceless. Just walking the neighborhood and picking up trash and putting the trash in the garbage bag and theorizing where the trash came from. But, and hearing what his thoughts are on people, disposing of their trash in the public setting. It's really interesting. And being able to say, look, there's positive evidence of you and your walk on this street by picking up this trash. And that for me is really cool. There's a newness, a freshness, a vitality that he's brought that I'm really excited about. 47 years old. I feel young. He's keeping me young, and and more importantly, curious, because I think that we all suffer the callousing that occurs through life experience, and I think it's more the losses than the wins, of course, that impact you the hardest. But having this new vital soul with zero apprehension and absolute curiosity has been the greatest thing for me. And I think it's impacted my career in a positive way and how I interact with others. And then frankly, it's allowed it's given me some new life in terms of thinking about how to be an architect. So that's what you'll find me doing, is always looking for looking for new ways to practice, always looking for ways to be better. And maybe at some point I can collaborate with you, you Chris, or you the audience, on how we can be better together. But ultimately, we've got to do better for our cities. I think design is paramount, and good design is massively impactful. So let's do it.
Well, design, travel, relationships, and dating, those are pretty good four things that you can
I'm
find
writing them
yourself
down.
doing. So that's a
Yeah.
pretty great mix of, of things to be up
Yeah.
to. Nate, as a guest, thank you so much. As a friend, thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
on the show. It's great to hear, for me to learn more about your story, and to hear from you one to one, and then to be able to share this story with everyone. Thank you so much. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
I hope this is the first. I hope not the last of Nate Jenkins podcast. But I appreciate you all enduring my initiation in this forum. Sorry.
You
Thanks.
did great. You did great.
All right.
Thank you.